Hi there, today I'm studying Psalm number 34, and this is the book that I'm using. And wow, this one is really loaded with gold nuggets. I'm going to try to be as concise as possible, but there's a lot of things that I want to share with you. So it starts off in verse 1. It says, by David, when he feigned insanity before Avimelech, who then drove him away and he left. So this psalm is different from all the other psalms that I've ever read. And in fact, I think this is the first time that I've ever come across this psalm, and it has a lot to discuss and explain. So first of all, who is Avimelech? Avimelech was the king of a place called Gath. And just like in Egypt, how the rulers were always named Pharaoh. So it was like Pharaoh number 1, Pharaoh number 2, Pharaoh number 3, and the dynasty goes from father to son to son to son to son, etc. So similarly, in the land of Gath, the kings were called Avimelech, but this king, his particular name was Achish. So as an overview, this psalm speaks of the grave danger David was in the palace of Achish, who was the brother of Goliath. David acted like a madman, letting spittle run down his beard and writing on the doors, Achish, king of Gath, owes me 100,000 gold coins, leading Achish to eject him from the palace. In his joy, David composed this psalm in alphabetical sequence. So in those days, they didn't have photography. And so people from different countries didn't know what other rulers looked like unless they had seen a painting of them before. So David and this character Achish or Avimelech, they didn't necessarily have beef, but somebody who was Achish's guard wanted to kill David. And so David didn't know what to do to get out of the situation. So he acted as if he weren't King David, as if he was just somebody else, some crazy madman lunatic, so that he could get out of danger. So according to the Midrash, Midrash is folklore that's passed on from generation to generation. David had previously questioned God about the usefulness of insanity in the world. God told him that one day David would make use of it himself. When David stood before Achish and felt his life was threatened, he prayed to God, saying, "Grant me some of that insanity that you created." The Midrash implies that God granted him actual insanity so that he was not acting. Because in the Psalm, it says that he feigned insanity. So he was pretending to be insane. But then the folklore has a different version. They say like he actually was temporarily insane at that moment. So regarding the general message of this Midrash, perhaps the meaning is as follows. David could never have imagined that insanity would be of use to him, yet it turned out that it was. Similarly, God was teaching him that everything in the world has its purpose, even if the human mind cannot always perceive it. So we have this verse in Ecclesiastes, to everything there is a time and a purpose under heaven. And in fact, there's a Beatles song about it. So sometimes we don't understand, for example, what's the usefulness of a cockroach or a mosquito, but everything that's created in the world, even abstract concepts, have a time and a place. Okay, so even according to the first explanation of a sage known as Radak, it was still a miracle that they let him go and assumed beyond doubt that he was not David. So even though they assumed that it wasn't King David, they could have still killed him because he was acting very strangely. So between Abraham and King David, there were 14 generations or 600 years. And so even though this story is 3,000 years old, we can see that the insanity plea still, is true today. And perhaps it derives actually from this incident 3,000 years ago, where somebody could be freed of death if they plead insane. So for example, if somebody kills somebody, the the punishment might be, in some states they have the death row. So it might be that the punishment is death or life in jail. But if the person pleads that they're insane, then instead of being killed or being sentenced to life in jail, the person can instead live in a psych ward, which is a much better situation than a prison. So it's interesting how all of the Avimelechs in those days, they were all named Avimelech. And so that was ever since Abraham. So again, from Abraham to David, 14 generations, or approximately 600 years. And then from David to us is approximately 3,000 years. All right, so David had wondered aloud to God about the utility of insanity in the world, as we had discussed previously. When he was later saved thereby, he composed this psalm of praise and said, I bless God at all times, in times of reason and in times of folly. Similarly, in the beginning of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 31, we find God saw all that he made, and behold, it was very good. So God even created insanity, and there is a purpose for it, a use for it. All right, so I'm going to skip a page, and then there's some really good insights and commentary towards the end of this kind of long chapter. Chapter 34 has 23 verses, and this insight comes from the Baal Shem Tov, who was a Hasidic master about 300 years ago. So he taught that one who sees fault in his fellow is himself guilty of that fault to some degree. So Jewel wrote a song about this. It's called Pieces of You. So the fact that, for example, something that bothers me is hypocrisy. So when I see hypocrisy in the world, it bothers me. So now I need to be very conscious about being hypocritical myself. And so whenever we see something in other people that we don't like, it's because the other person is acting as a mirror, and we're actually seeing something about ourselves that we don't like. So the fact that a person observes something in his friend or in someone else is a prompt from heaven to address that same flaw within ourselves. Therefore, when you see a flaw in another person, guard your tongue from evil gossip about it. So don't talk bad about the other person doing the thing that you don't like. That's your pet peeve. Although the temptation to gossip is immense, the verse advises us on how we might avoid it. Recognize that you are seeing your fellow's flaw so that you might turn away from evil that is within you. So that's very deep and very true. And verse 19 says, oh, and I didn't quote the actual verse that came from. It was verse 15, and the line says, turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. Okay, so now verse 19, God is close to the brokenhearted and saves those with a crushed spirit. So there's a line that I heard, something like, the cracks are where the light shines in. And so sometimes God has to crack us. So to kind of like shake us out of our complacency, to wake us up. And we're given these unpleasant wake-up calls because when our spirit gets crushed, we are like a grape that you have to crush it in order to make wine, or like an olive that you have to be crushed in order to make olive oil. So sometimes the very like good thing that's inside of a person or a fruit, it needs to be crushed in order to bring it out. So being brokenhearted, such as like what's happening in the world right now, being brokenhearted about, the hostages, the war, the injured, all the atrocities that are happening, that kind of brings us to a place of brokenheartedness where we like cry out to God, because sometimes like God is trying to get our attention because we've like forgotten about God or didn't make God a priority. Verse 21, he protects all his bones, not one of them is broken. God says, you have 248 limbs, and there are 248 positive commandments in the Torah, which is the Old Testament or the 5 books of Moses. If you maintain the Torah, I will maintain your body. As it says, he protects all his bones, not one of them is broken. This verse can be read as he protects all his bones, for one of them is not broken. This is a reference to the indestructible Luz bone. I looked it up. It's L-U-Z. It's at the very base of the skull, at the top of the spine, is the L-U-Z bone, okay, from which the body can be regenerated at the time of the resurrection. So there's this idea that when the Messiah comes, he will resurrect the dead, that people who were good people who lived in previous generations will come back to life. And so how is that possible? From this Luz bone, which apparently does not decay or become destructed. So thank you so much for watching. There's lots of great information and history in this psalm, but one of the take-home messages, I guess I would say, is that whenever you see something in someone else that bothers you, dig deeper into yourself and see how you can improve in that area. And instead of judging the other person, work on improving yourself and avoid gossiping. So thanks again for watching. May God bless you in all that you do. Have a great day. Bye-bye.